Sarah's my girl. She left us. The black hole. I got her.
Grief has always been an unavoidable part of the human experience, yet for the longest time in film and TV it's typically been oversimplified, represented as a one-size-fits-all set of 5 stages that's solved by the end of the story.
You made my life, Holly, but I'm just one chapter in yours. There'll be more. Don't be afraid to fall in love again.
After the events of 2020 forced our culture to collectively process grief and loss on a mass scale, the old-school formulaic template feels even more outdated. And media is at last giving us more diverse and in-depth depictions of the many forms grief takes, helping us to challenge a lot of the conventional assumptions about loss. Here's our take on how we've been misunderstanding grief all this time.
Look at that man. Tragic.
That is shit grieving. No one grieves like that unless they're in a film.
Who are you to pass judgment on his
Italy?
grief?
If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and click the bell to be notified about all of our new videos.
According to the Kubler-Ross model, denial is just one of the 5 stages of grief.
Jesus Christ.
For a long time, our popular understanding of grief has been shaped by the Kubler-Ross model, more commonly known as the 5 stages.
Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance.
This model was initially theorized to describe those with terminal illness, but it's commonly applied to all forms of grief. As Ada McVean writes, the narrative of the Kubler-Ross model reminds us that whatever we're feeling now isn't permanent. It essentially guides us through a difficult time and assures us that eventually we will reach acceptance and be okay. But pop culture has routinely told us that this is how the grieving process always works. In Frasier, after Frasier loses his job, the episode is structured around him moving through each of the 5 stages in turn.
The loss of the job is like a death, and they cope with it the same way they would with a death, by going through a series of stages.
Each of the phases moves quickly, is easily diagnosed by those around him,
Do you think you might be depressed?
and by the end he is ready to move past grief and towards his new life.
Frasier, I just have to say bravo. You're slim, well-adjusted. You've really turned things around, haven't you?
In The Simpsons, when Ned Flanders loses his wife, Ned's progression throughout the episode is similarly linear, including anger.
She was hot. What? You can't take a compliment? Hot? You monster! That's good. No, let it out.
Denial.
This feels so disloyal to Maude.
And bargaining with God.
I've been wondering if your decision to take Maude was, well, wrong.
Before reaching acceptance. After this process, he goes back to the person he was, and he meets a potential new love interest, signaling he's reopening to the world.
Maybe when we get back, you and I could get together.
Well, maybe we can. My name's Ned Flanders, and I'm here every week. Rain or shine.
Even in longer narrative arcs, grief is still typically viewed as a set of stages you need to move through to build yourself back together again.
Last time we spoke, you were at the anger stage of grief. Now you've moved to bargaining.
In Grey's Anatomy, after Izzy's fiancé Denny tragically dies, she falls into a grief spiral that threatens her future as a doctor.
I thought I was a surgeon, but I can't. I thought I was a surgeon, but I am not. So I quit.
But despite the severity of Izzy's grief,
I miss him. All the time I miss him.
there is still a natural upward progression toward acceptance, which is followed by a resumption of her normal life. It's striking that in many of these examples, the person returns in most significant ways to who they were and what their life was like before their loss. Izzy goes back to her work as a doctor, falls back into her old patterns, and eventually rekindles an old romance that leads to her getting married.
Today, Izzy Stevens, our life together begins.
The problem with representations such as these is that grief is characterized as something you overcome and move on from. The acceptance stage is painted as an acknowledgement that a character has suffered a loss, but not as an understanding that they will be forever fundamentally changed by the experience.
If this baby's a girl, we'd like to name it Shelby. That's how it should be. Life goes on.
The superhero genre, to its credit, does often depict grief as transforming. Loss is often a significant part of a protagonist's origin story. Still, many of these hero narratives reduce grief to a brief, simplistic plot point, usually the hero's inciting incident, only a stepping stone on their journey toward becoming a powerful hero.
With great power comes great responsibility.
The narrative typically deals with the grief quickly and leaves it behind after it's served the purpose of motivating the hero's mission.
She's not coming back. We have to make it worth it. We have to.
We will.
In the majority of pop culture, getting to the acceptance stage equals closing the book on grief.
But over time, it will hurt less and less. And eventually, you'll remember her and it'll only hurt a little.
But in reality, actual acceptance means acknowledging that things will never be the same and finding a new way to live.
I've not moved on from Aaron. I've moved forward with him.
You were so traumatized by your dad's death, you lost the use of your legs for 3 months.
Throughout the history of film and TV, there have been some standout examples that have shed a more nuanced light on the messy reality of grief.
Christine is dead. She is dead. Dead, 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 dead.
One of the earliest golden age of television shows, 6 Feet Under, essentially made grief a main character, structuring each episode around the funeral of a person we witness die at the beginning. In the pilot, that person is the central family's patriarch, and this sets off a messy, seasons-long process of grieving that transforms each family member as they discover new, previously unknown sides of themselves.
I had never seen such grief. And at the time, it gave me the creeps, but now I think it's probably so much more healthy.
In recent years, we've seen even more stories that break from the old model and more realistically present grief as chaotic behavior.
People grieve in all sorts of different ways. You're using heroin, and you're having sex with anyone who asks. I'm not sure that these things are making you happy.
Since as a society we're so primed to recognize only the clear-cut 5 stages that have long been reinforced in film and TV, we may not easily recognize these stories as the grief narratives they are.
What's there to talk about? It's all meaningless, right?
I hope it's not all meaningless.
Fleabag's foul-mouthed, sexually adventurous anti-heroine won't immediately strike some audiences as a character who's hurting. But eventually it becomes clear that her behavior is shaped by the fact that she's grieving 2 losses, the deaths of both her best friend and her mother.
Dad books us boob appointments once a year to make sure our tits don't turn on us like Mum's did. It's a bit of a hassle, but at the end of the day, it's nice to be touched.
Like Fleabag, Allison on The Affair expresses her grief through her sexuality, but at first it's easy to overlook that this is what's driving her because we're seeing parts of the story through the eyes of the man she's having an affair with, and he's not initially grasping this.
What do you see now? When you look at me?
What do you think I see?
Death.
Promising Young Woman is most talked about as a feminist revenge fantasy. Yet we can understand Cassie's behavior more fully when we read it as a response to her grieving her best friend Nina.
Is your friend okay?
No, she's not.
And in early episodes of Stranger Things, Hopper is perceived as uncaring and incompetent.
Joyce Byers can't find her son this morning.
Okay, I'm gonna get on that. We've discussed this. Mornings are for coffee and contemplation.
Because he's disassociating in order to cope with the loss of his daughter. The self-destructiveness of these characters suggests they are all suffering from complicated grief, a recognized disorder that can persist for a long time. It presents as avoiding social contact.
You know I don't have any friends, Mom.
Lack of purpose.
You didn't mean, what am I doing working in a shitty coffee shop?
Or an inability to enjoy life and can exacerbate existing symptoms of depression. In these examples where the theme of grief is hidden below the surface, it's often expressed as or disguised in other behaviors and emotions. In 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, Mildred's grief manifests as rage directed at the police department she believes have failed to adequately investigate her daughter's death.
It seems to me the local police department is too busy going around torturing black folks to be bothered doing anything about solving actual crime.
In Mayor of Easttown, the protagonist's navigation of grief is erratic. She lashes out at her family and seems to have very little empathy for the missing girl whose case dominates the town.
Katie Bailey was a known drug abuser with a history of prostitution. She's probably lying at the bottom of the Delaware River right now.
But as the show progresses, it becomes clear that she is attempting to come to terms with her own son's death, and most significantly, recognize that her life will never be the same.
You've been hiding behind other people's grief. Even after these cases get solved, the grief is still going to be there waiting for you until you confront it.
This modern representation of grief doesn't push the unrealistic idea that life goes back to normal, but rather that moving forward is possible.
Does it get any easier?
After a while, you'll learn to live with the unacceptable. You realize that you still need to put food in the pantry, pay the electric bill.
Notable modern horror movies, especially haunted house movies, often focus on women's grief, using the typically feminine space of the house to explore female trauma.
They put a curse on us when we brought Charlie back. We made a pact with something.
something that is in his house.
These narratives emphasize that grief often feels like a monster that invades our personal spaces and minds. We can't ignore it or systematically defeat it, but through confronting it, we can learn to tame it.
It's all right.
Maybe the biggest shift in our understanding of grief is that we no longer associate it specifically with the death of a loved one, but more broadly with the idea of loss, whether that be the loss of a relationship.
As you come apart, you're reminded that this is a person you had great feeling for.
A moment in your life.
Wait, what happened? Could go in sadness. Now when Riley thinks of that moment with Dad, she's gonna feel sad.
Or an idea of who you are as a person. In I May Destroy You, Arabella's trauma after experiencing a sexual assault not only robs her of her sense of security, but also of her idea of who she was before the attack. In order to arrive at acceptance of what happened to her, she fantasizes about confronting her abuser in different ways, from outright violence to empathetic understanding.
What's happening? I'm scared. You won't leave me, will you? Please don't leave me.
Eventually, she comes to terms with the fact that she's unlikely to obtain the kind of clear-cut closure she craves. As we've seen with other characters, she can only move forward as a new self. And in her case, that transformation is expressed through her art.
Your new piece, January 22nd, published independently, is similar to your previous work, but in other ways it feels like it could be the work of an entirely different writer.
In Sound of Metal, Ruben is grieving the loss of his hearing, and as a result, his life as a touring musician with his girlfriend.
I can't f***ing hear you. Do you understand me? I can't. I'm f***ing deaf.
At first, he struggles to fully accept a new life in a deaf community, instead fixating on cochlear implant surgery that would fix his hearing loss. But after the surgery isn't the solution he expected, he at last starts letting go of who he used to be and finds some peace in the silence.
Those moments of stillness, that place, that's the kingdom of God.
In Nomadland, Fern traverses the country in the aftermath of her husband's death and the almost total evacuation of the town that they lived in.
What's remembered lives. I maybe spent too much of my life just remembering.
Through her travels, Fern proves that acceptance of grief can also be forming an entirely new concept of home or outlook on life. These diverse stories drive home that grief is a universal experience that reframes everything in our lives. Yet this process rarely looks the same from one individual to another.
Out here, there's a lot of people our age, and inevitably there's grief and loss. And a lot of them don't get over it either. And that's okay.
You're saying I should get over my sadness by getting really sad so I can be miserable and realize the person I love the most is never, ever coming back?
I think that would help you heal.
The way characters experience grief emotionally is changing too. A typically overlooked component of grief is how it can be misunderstood even by those experiencing it. In the second season of Feel Good, May deals with the grief of realizing that past experiences were actually abusive.
Hey guys, can you give me some space?
Why? They can stay. They knew. Everybody knew.
The show acknowledges the sometimes non-linear path of grief by having May continue to invalidate their own experiences even after confronting them.
It's stuff that I think to other people might not seem that bad, but maybe it is to me or something.
Today's stories are also more ready to acknowledge that grieving can include moments of real joy and peace.
There's a sunrise and a sunset every day, and you can choose to be there for it.
In Kirsten Johnson's documentary, Dick Johnson is Dead, she confronts the impending death of her father by comically filming him dying in all manner of slapstick, cartoonish ways.
Everybody has to sort of prepare because everybody dies.
The film accepts that the sadness of grief is directly proportional to the happiness we get from loving someone while they're alive. In Dead to Me, after Jen and Judy develop a friendship after meeting through a grief counseling group,
And for not being repulsed by my version of grief.
Thank you. For the same.
in some ways, Jen's new friendship seems to make her happier than her marriage did.
She's the only person who has been here for me. The only person that doesn't make me feel like I am failing at everything.
Pixar has also regularly returned to grief as a theme and uses it to show that loss can bring people together and to be a catalyst for new, joyful experiences. Up begins with a heartbreaking sequence of Carl Fredricksen's wife dying.
What do I do now, Ellie?
But this turns out to be the prologue to a new adventure in honor of her memory.
We're on our way, Ellie.
In Coco, death is also not seen as an end, but rather the beginning of new generations. Miguel's family and culture at large grieve by celebrating the lives of their deceased loved ones and continuing to have a relationship with them.
This isn't a dream then. You're all really out there.
You thought we weren't?
In Onward, Ian lashes out at his brother Barley partly out of jealousy that Barley had a relationship with their dad, while Ian was born after he died. But eventually, Ian realizes that Barley was the father figure he never had, a bond that was able to form as a result of grief.
I had someone who looked out for me, someone who pushed me to be more than I ever thought I could be. I never had a dad, but I always had you.
Grief can also look different from culture to culture. In The Farewell, Billy must deal with the fact that her Chinese family wants to keep her grandmother in the dark about her own terminal illness, while Billy, who was raised in Queens, feels they need to tell her. Throughout the film, the characters argue over whether the Western or Eastern approach to death and loss is the right approach, all while Billy grieves the life she could have had if she had been raised in China with her extended family.
这正是西方和东方的文化差异问题。东方人是把生命看作是集体的家庭。
At the conclusion of the film, there is no definitive answer, because Billy seems to have learned that there is no correct way to grieve. The only right thing to do is respect that there is more than one way to cope with hardship. One of the most honest looks at collective grief in TV of the last decade is in The Leftovers, which follows the world trying to make sense of the mysterious disappearance of 2% of the entire population. A key problem in the story is the human drive to understand loss. The intense yearning to make sense of the truly unexplainable leads to a proliferation of radical cults and extremist religions taking over society.
They seem to have an agenda that they want to remind the world that the world has changed.
Yet again, one of the takeaways of the show is that it's not possible to return to the before times. The final piece that's available to its two central characters isn't through restoring their families, but in discovering a new home and loving each other.
Will you dance with me?
In the superhero genre, Avengers: Infinity War and Endgame do find a way to reverse a similarly global loss, following a 50% population erasure instead of 2.
We won. This is Stark.
But the TV series WandaVision represents a truly noteworthy step forward for the superhero grief narrative. Wanda initially uses fantastical sitcom worlds to flee from her grief after losing her love, Vision.
Sharing a love like you never seen.
She eventually realizes the only way out is through. Still, instead of this leading to a traditional portrait of acceptance, Wanda finds peace by focusing on the emotion that fuels her grief, love.
She's gonna drown me.
No. No, it won't. It can't all be sorrow, can it?
The message is that our loved ones are a part of us even after they are gone.
What is grief? If not love, persevering.
And Wanda realizes that to honor that love, she has to be the most powerful and ethical witch she can be, and leave open the chance of reuniting with her kids or Vision in some future form.
That's what I might be next.
Throughout 2020, we all learned firsthand that grief is not just a loss, but something that changes you. As a more nuanced understanding of the grief process makes its way into the media, this allows us to acknowledge that grief is a much bigger, more omnipresent part of our lives than many of us previously understood. We're also understanding more that grief is not something that goes away quickly, if ever. Taken together, this new perspective can build our empathy for people going through complicated and self-destructive experiences in the aftermath of loss.
You are so desperate to not feel sad, you've made your whole world about this boy. I want you to allow yourself to acknowledge the pain you so clearly feel.
The only tools we have in the face of the worst emotional experience we all go through at some point on this earth are understanding and each other.
You are not alone in your sorrow. And there's no shame in grieving for those you love.
This is The Take on your favorite movies, shows, and culture.
Thank you so much for watching and for supporting us.
Please subscribe and never miss a take.